Today, Chloe and I discuss neutral spine. What is it? Can we measure it? And should we measure it? We're going to dive deep into the Pilates history archives, as well as take a tour through some of the highlights of the science on the topic. So all that coming up.
Hey, Raph.
Hey, how are you?
I'm really good today. I'm genuinely very good. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it. You've got a good country and western look going on.
Yes, well, dear listeners, I did have another top chosen, and then I was strobing like some hectic, one of those kaleidoscopes as a kid that you look into and it does all the funny stuff to your eyes. That's what my shirt was going to do to anyone who watched.
You were strobing like it was 1995 and you were at a rave party.
Yeah. It was, the flashbacks are making me feel a little nauseous, but that's exactly what was going on, Raph. So I have had to change very quickly. So now I am a bit more country and western. I kind of go between the other top was very sort of 60s, 70s, and now I'm very country and western.
This is very Tammy Wynette.
Yeah. So I'm down with it. But I'm great. I'm really good. I had a very sick kitten last week who is now 100% better. So that is it's amazing to see a little creature go from so crook and at the vets for a day in an oxygen chamber to running around like they don't have a care in the world. So
the body's amazing.
It's incredible, really, really incredible. So shout out Melbourne Cat Vets for being the absolute caring legends. So yeah, that's fine. I'm in a good mood. How about you, Raph?
Yeah, I am also in a good mood. Thanks for asking. I'm trying to vary it up,
He didn't say awesome. Are we all a little worried?
Yeah, I've just been in a flow state this morning. What is it now? A bit after 2 in the afternoon here in podcast land, and since early this morning I've been just kind of in a work zone, kind of just writing. I've been editing this book I've written, and that's been awesome because I got some great feedback from people. Sent it out to a bunch of people to read and give me feedback, and a lot of people gave me really good quality feedback, which was awesome. So I've made a bunch of changes to it.
Great, a whole heap of editors.
Yeah. So I got people to give me feedback on the content and the flow, and did it make sense, and was there anything missing, and all that kind of stuff. Not like did I miss a full stop or
right, gotcha. Gotcha.
Any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So
exciting.
What are we going to talk about today, Chloe?
Okay, something that something that I find myself talking about quite regularly. So I'd really love to, basically the bottom line is it's neutral spine. What is it? Should we care about it? Should we be trying to find it in a Pilates class, whether that be via palpation or visual assessment? Is it necessary? That's really what I'd like to talk about today. And TLDR, which I love saying now that you told me what it meant, Raph. Too long, didn't read. Just in case there's anyone like me that was like, what the hell does that mean? It doesn't matter. But what I'd like to do today is really come up with a great set of ways that we can help empower our instructors to be able to understand why we don't have to worry about it in a Pilates class. And deeply understand that, because I think with you've got to understand that in order to let go of maybe the fear around it not being an important thing or it not being something that you need to cue with your clients. And I do think it's still quite a pervasive concept in the Pilates realm. And I see it's interesting. I see otherwise seemingly quite fearless instructors still going in for the palpation of the ASIS and pubic symphysis is it pubic symphysis or pubic? I don't know what they're trying to palpate, but, trying to palpate that triangle type.
I think, on themselves though, obviously, not on the clients.
Themselves, not on someone else. For God, no, but on themselves. But I still see instructors doing that, particularly in footwork. So I really want to see if we can pull that, unpack that a bit, debunk it, but also give you the tools to feel confident that you don't need to do that, you don't need to teach that. How's that sound, Raph?
Sounds like an awesome episode coming up, Chloe.
I thought so. That's why I chose it. So, yeah, I mean, where do we start? I think we need to start with, what do you think?
Well, I think there are a few things like, all right, well, what is neutral spine?
Mm-hmm.
You know, where does this notion of neutral spine being important come from in Pilates? And what's the science on, like, is it actually important? And can we actually palpate and, tell if we're in neutral, etc.?
Yeah. Awesome. And I'd love to sort of talk about why it seems so prevalent to palpate in footwork when you're laying on your back. So we might have a little bit of chat about shear forces, etc. as well, I think is
sure.
Be an important one. Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to leave the anatomy and biomechanics to you, Raphael Bender, because I do believe that is your jam. So could you start with a little what is neutral? What is it?
Well, we have, for a long time when I was first teaching Pilates, like several years, I thought of neutral as a position, a position of the spine where the anterior superior iliac spine is level with the symphysis pubis, and that the lumbar has its natural lordotic curve, which is an anterior convex curve.
That natural lordotic curve.
Natural lordotic curve.
I've said that one before.
And so, so that's what I was taught when I was a kid growing up in Pilates world, and I think that's what a lot of us were taught. And so
you taught me, Raphael Bender.
Yeah, I taught you it. I taught a lot of people it. And so it wasn't until, I can't remember exactly when, but probably like 5-6 years ago, that I learned that neutral is not actually a position, it's a zone, it's a range. Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm going to learn something here. This is cool.
Well, and this is kind of diving down, a little bit into the esoteric biomechanics world, but basically neutral, spinal biomechanists, people who study biomechanics of the spine, define neutral as the position where all of the ligaments, it's around the mid-range of the spine, not flexed, not extended, not side bent, etc., where all of the ligaments are loose, right? So if you think about the spine, the vertebral column, you've got a whole stack of lumbar vertebrae, one on top of the other, then thoracic vertebrae on top of those. And there's up the front of all of the vertebrae, right from bottom to top, there's something called the anterior longitudinal ligament. And it's a ligament that runs the whole length of the spinal column, and it just is directly on the front of the vertebral bodies, right? It's like this kind of seat belt, textured thing that goes right up the front. And then there's one at the back, inside the spinal canal, like on the very back of the vertebral bodies, inside the spinal canal where the spinal cord goes, called the posterior longitudinal ligament. So you've got this ligament at the front, ligament at the back, and the ligament at the front gets tight when you bend backwards, right? So if you can picture this spinal column, right, and the ligament at the front, you picture the spinal column bending backwards, like into extension. If you can picture that ligament at the front kind of getting tight as that happens, right?
Yeah.
And the one at the back, the posterior longitudinal ligament, when you bend backwards, that posterior longitudinal ligament gets a bit lax, it gets loose, right? And vice versa when you bend forwards, right? So when you bend forwards, the posterior ligaments get tight, and the anterior ligaments, the ligaments at the front, go slack.
Yes.
And then, of course, there are ligaments at the sides, and there are the ligaments all around. Like there are ligaments totally surrounding the whole spinal column. And, so it's the same where you've got ligaments on the sides. When you bend to the left, the ligaments on the right go tight, okay, and the ligaments on the left go slack. And then vice versa when you bend, So basically, whichever way you bend, some ligament somewhere gets tight, and the other ligament on the other side gets loose, okay? But when you're in the very mid-range, when you're neither forward bent nor backward bent, neither side bent, one way or the other, all of the ligaments are basically lax, right? There's not really any tension on any of them. And so the ligaments in this range, it's a range of about 10 degrees, okay? So it's not a very big range, but it's a range of about 10 degrees where the spine can bend forwards or backwards, sideways or sideways, twist a little bit, and none of the ligaments provide any restraint to that movement, right? So there's no kind of structural, well, not really structural is not the right word. There's no ligamentous, reason why the spine can't just bend a little bit forwards or backwards from that position. So it's basically the loosey-goosey position of the spine where muscles really provide the only restraining force on the spine within that small range of about 10 degrees. Yeah, so that's what neutral is.
Okay, so that's super interesting. So, Raph, can everyone find that position? I guess that's something I've often pondered.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is probably not, because probably for a couple of reasons. One is maybe some people can't attain it, like maybe people who are very kyphotic, for example, or have a lot of head forwards position or scoliotic or something, where their centre of mass is not directly in, halfway from front to back of their feet sort of thing, so that they are a bit bent, so the ligaments at the back or the side or whatever are more tight than, the ligaments on the opposite side of the spine. So I'd say, for some people, no, probably can't attain it. But more to the point, even for people who can, have the physical capacity to be in that position, we can't really measure it accurately. Like, we can't really tell when someone's in neutral. That's the thing.
Okay, right. So we've determined what neutral is. We've determined that some people can naturally attain it. Some people probably can't. And so now we're saying, but can you see it? Can you touch it? No.
Yeah, and the answer is no and no. Like,
the answer is no and no. Okay,
yeah,
I think that's probably crucial, right?
Yeah.
Because what are we doing? What are we doing?
Yeah, what are we doing?
What are we doing? Because I know that obviously breathe education, we haven't taught a postural assessment for many moons now.
2013, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So long time. Once we know better, we do better, and once you knew better, we changed it up, right? Because that's what's so cool about breathe education, and we're constantly evolving with the latest evidence, etc. But I do know for a fact, Raph, that a lot of Pilates training courses are definitely still teaching postural analysis and palpating of neutral and lining people up to, the plumb lines and all of those things. A lot of physios
do it as well, which is, disappointing because it's contradicts, best practice for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
And physios of all people, I think, should know better. So shout out to all the good evidence-based physios out there who don't give postural advice.
Yeah. And you see it, and it's the whole, that you're standing next to a client and you've got a thumb on their ASIS or vice versa, maybe a thumb on their PSIS and then the ASIS, and you, oh my goodness, and you're with your fingers and your eyes determining whether they've got, too much of an anterior pelvic tilt or too much of a posterior pelvic tilt, and what's this sweet sort of Goldilocks, midway position, which is the Holy Grail neutral. So I think we need to delve into, and look, we have talked about this in previous podcast episodes, but what I really wanted to do with today's episode was put it all in the one place, so that this is a great resource for you as an instructor to go back to when you're like, I remember that's not a thing, but why is it not a thing? How do I, or maybe you're having it, because this is something that's coming up a lot, Raph, is I hear from grads that are having to have those kind of difficult conversations with maybe their managers or peers who are adamant that it is a thing. So I want this to be a resource where you can share it, you can use it to have as a discussion point and to come and find some factoids. So let's go into that, Raph, like the science behind why can't I, with my hands, tell if someone's pelvis is in air quotes neutral Maybe it doesn't have to be air quotes because neutral exists. So I'm not going to do air quotes. In neutral, I'm just going to do in neutral. The air quotes were redundant there. Why can't I see it or why can't I palpate it?
Well, three main reasons. First one is that people's shape, the shape of people's bones is quite variable. I mean, if you look, if you're in a room with someone or if you're listening to this, I'm sure you know people you can call to mind their facial features, your loved ones, your friends, whatever. And it's for darn tootin' that if you had, 4 or 5 of your loved ones in a room together, you could tell them apart. Even if you just saw their face on a postage stamp sized, window on Zoom, you could still tell which one was which. And that is because we have differently shaped facial bones that give our face, as well as different eye colour and hair colour and whatever. But, the shape of our faces largely is derived from the shape of our facial bones and, the skull bone underneath, how deeply set our eyes are, how wide apart our eyes are, the size of our nose, how high and prominent our cheekbones are, all of these things, our jaw prominence, the shape of our jaw, all of these things are related to the different shapes of the bones. And so, we kind of take that totally for granted in skulls, right? We'd be shocked if we saw 2 people with identical faces unless they were identical twins, But for some reason, we expect everyone's pelvises to be identical.
Got a great analogy. Oh my God, I love that. What an awesome analogy. Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
So there's a study, can't remember the year, but it's like 2016, something like that, called Variations in Pelvic Morphology May Prevent the Identification of Anterior Pelvic Tilt. And morphology means shape, right? It's what the researchers say to prove that haven't wasted their money on buying a PhD, earning a PhD. They didn't buy a PhD, but they had to pay for the study. So they use words like morphology instead of shape.
I love that word, morphology. Yeah. I love it. I actually use that word. I like that word, yeah.
But anyway, so what they did was, and I think we've talked about this one before, so I won't spend too much time on it, but they got basically 20
Raph,
cadaver pelvises.
Double click. I'd like you to spend some time on it because I want this to be like I want this episode to be the one that resource, they can come straight to it.
Well,
spend
I'll
a bit
link
of time
to it in the
on
show
it.
notes. There's some great photos in it. So basically what they did was they got cadaver pelvises, people had donated their body to science, and they dissected out the pelvises and they took out the left and the right half of the pelvis and they put them each in a jig, which is basically just a special clamp that holds them at a very precise angle. And so they lined up the ASIS and the symphysis pubis in a vertical line, that's kind of the definition of neutral, in like neutral pelvis in, a lot of textbooks. And then what they did was they measured the height of the iliac crest, the height of the PSIS relative to those things, and then relative to the other side of the same pelvis. And what they found was there's quite a bit of variation. I haven't got the study in front of me, but it was something like up to 11 millimetres of variation side to side in the height of the ASIS.
Wow.
So
11 millimetres.
Yeah. And now, I haven't got the study right in front of me. That might be a little bit off, but, look in the study. It was quite a bit. It was definitely, of that order of magnitude. Quite a large variation in the height from side to side of the iliac crest. Quite a variation in the height from side to side of the PSIS relative to the ASIS. And also they found that it wasn't the case, which is one of the things that I was taught when I was doing my Pilates training, it wasn't the case that females had PSIS higher than the ASIS. It would just seem to be like normally distributed, so some people did, some people didn't. And whether you were male or female didn't seem to make much difference to it.
Where did that myth come from then?
It came from my Stop Pilates manual as far as I'm concerned. I don't know where it came from. It probably I guess they Stop Pilates sort of excerpted a lot of Kendall's work from posture and pain, muscles testing and function. So they actually had photocopies from that book in their manual. So I guess that's where it must have come from. But anyway, so people's pelvises are not symmetrical, and one person's pelvis is not the exact same shape as another person's pelvis. duh. I mean, look at people's faces. If you look at anyone's face, just go look at your own face closely in the mirror, something's not symmetrical. Your nose is a bit crooked, one eye's a bit higher than the other eye, one ear's a bit higher than the other ear, your smile's crooked, something's crooked about all of us. We're all not perfectly straight, So why would our pelvises be any different? So that's one thing. The second thing is there's actually variation in the length of people's spinous processes as well. So the pochiati bones on the back of the spine. So if you're someone who's got very long lumbar spinous processes, okay, well, you can appear to be very flat even when you're, quote, in a lordosis, right? So if the vertebral bodies are in a lordosis, but if the spinous processes of, say, the L2, 3 and 4 are quite long, okay, that can make the spine, when you palpate it, seem more flat. And I've got a study, again, I can't remember the name of it, but I'll dig it out and stick it in the show notes. It's got a lovely, if you dig into the study, it's got some nice side view X-rays and CTs where you can look and go, that person's actually in like a lordosis, but you look at their spine it actually looks flat, right? And so you're looking at that person going, oh no, you're flexed, you're in lumbar flexion, but actually no, they're lordotic. Wow. So you can't, just by palpating and looking at the bones, whether it's the pelvis or the lumbar spine or the thoracic, you can't actually tell whether that is neutral or not neutral because the bones are not symmetrical and regularly shaped on everybody. The second thing is we're really shit at palpating accurately bony landmarks, even though we're super confident and we definitely feel like, oh yeah, I totally found the spot, but it's like, nah, dude, that's not the spot. Because when we do studies, and I've got a systematic review, I think here, from 2020 or something like that, that's basically looked at a whole bunch of studies of experienced physiotherapists, and basically got this physiotherapist in the room and said, okay, there's a client lying on the table with, no shirt on, find their L5 spinous process, and then they get, 20 more physios to come in and find the same spot on the same person. And guess what? They find 20 different versions of
I remember that study.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so this is experienced manual therapists. Okay. This is not like, baby practitioners one day out of college or anything. And, so our confidence that we can accurately palpate bony landmarks far exceeds our actual ability to accurately palpate bony landmarks. Mm-hmm. Besides which, actually our eyes as well, so here's the third reason, our eyes are a lot less accurate than we think they are as well. Like I see posts from time to time on Instagram where people are going, oh, train your eye so you can pick up, what's going on in this exercise. And to a certain extent, you can tell, okay, someone flexing their shoulder or extending their shoulder, are they standing on one leg or two legs? Sure, you can pick up that sort of thing. But we've got pretty good research evidence showing that under laboratory conditions, experienced physiotherapists can't pick up spinal flexion unless it's beyond 34 degrees, which is quite a lot of spinal flexion. So anywhere between 0 and 33 degrees, they can't tell the difference.
Yeah, right.
And this is in a squat or a deadlift. So I think we're really kidding ourselves when we think that we can detect these things. Like we're basically just imagining it and making up stories that we're detecting it. And I don't say that with any, disrespect or censure. I mean, I used to think I could detect those things as well. And when I palpate, which I never do, but if I did, I would be certain I can feel the PSIS under there. I know where it is, right? But so my senses tell me that I'm feeling it, right? But just because I've read all the research, I'm like, yeah, dude, no, you're just freaking kidding yourself, right? But it sure feels like I can feel it, right?
And I remember with the STOT exam, and you had to sort of, tell if someone's pelvis was rotated and all these awfully nocebic things that really meant sweet FA. Yeah. But the more things you could pick up, right, the better you did at the exam.
Yeah.
You were actually you were looking for things, right? Because if you could pick up those nuances, you know, that slight rotation and that one hip was a little bit higher than the other and all of these things, it was like, oh boy. Yeah.
I mean, posture analysis, I think there's so many things problematic about it. You know, we don't have one posture. You know, there's research showing people's posture changes throughout the day. People's posture changes when they've got, you know, more or less energy. When emotions, massively tied to posture. I mean, if you see your mum or your best friend walking, you know, across the street, right, you can tell within 2 seconds what kind of mood they're in, you know, by their posture. You know, when they're 100 yards away, you can't really see their facial expression, but you can tell whether they're pissed off at you or whatever just by the way they're swinging their hips or whatever it is. And so it's like posture's intimately connected to emotion. It's like it's like facial expression. It's part of our toolkit for nonverbal communication. So of course it's variable, you know, of course it's variable. So there's studies showing that as well. When we get people to stand or sit or whatever and measure their posture repeatedly, it's different, you know, and they come back 3 days later, it's different. So it's not that someone goes from like rigid kyphosis lordosis and then 2 minutes later they're kind of like this loose and flexible sway back, but it's like people's posture is not, it is variable within a range.
And I always say too, you know, we think we're going to change, if you think you're going to change someone's posture, like inherently change it with them coming to your class maybe like twice a week, you know, 2 hours out of the rest of the hours in their week, and you think that's going to be what changes inherently their posture, I think, you know, we're kidding ourselves.
Agreed. So, all right. So, you know, so neutral's a zone. It's not a position of the spine, but, you know, we do define neutral pelvis, you know, in the textbooks as ASIS and symphysis pubis lined up. And that's just really a convention. It's not based on anything in particular. It's not to say that people actually walk around in that position. Also,
I was saying pubic symphysis, which is not the right thing, is it? It's symphysis pubis, not pubic symphysis. Pubic symphysis, isn't that the issue? That's pain in the symphysis pubis?
No,
potentially.
I use the terms interchangeably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I don't know if I'm right or wrong about that.
I just had a moment where I was like, am I just using a totally incorrect terms?
No, I think you're thinking about
right now live on
pubis. Air.
Yeah. I am. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Well, so, all right, so we talked about what neutral is. We talked about, can we tell if someone's in neutral? And the answer is hell no, we can't. Okay, and I think the next thing that we need to think about is like, well, should we even care if someone's in neutral?
100%.
Before we get to that, let's take a break. Before the break, we said, should we even care about if someone's in neutral? And it'd be convenient if we didn't have to care, because it turns out we can't actually tell if they're in neutral or not. So if we had to care about it, that would be quite stressful. But the good news is we don't need to care.
We don't need to care. Okay. And I am wholeheartedly on board with that, and I wholeheartedly do not care. But there are still a lot of...
You don't care with all of your heart.
With all of my heart, I do not care. However, I do care that some people still care. So I want to work through that. So the main thing that as I said earlier in the episode, the main thing that I observe in my classes, and the majority of my clients don't care because I don't care, and I haven't taught caring about neutral or palpation of neutral or finding a neutral in footwork, for instance, for literally many years. There absolutely 100% was a time where I did have all of my clients lay on their back, create the little triangle, try and get it even, try and maintain that as they're doing their footwork. So there was a time where I did it.
Sticking my hand up, me too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that clients that I have in my classes now who are, for all intents and purposes, seemingly quite fearless with their movement and you know, embrace all the things that I'm sort of teaching them and getting them to explore from a movement perspective, which I think is really quite fearless movement and really awesome, there still seems to be this lingering need for some to try and find that neutral pelvic alignment, particularly when in footwork. So for me, I think if I think about the old narrative as to why we used to think we needed to care about that, well, it really came down to a sheer force thing, right? In that if you are in a neutral alignment, your spine is going to, withstand load better than if you were in. So AKA it's safer to be in a neutral alignment when you're doing something like footwork. So I think that I'd really love to bust that myth.
Well, I think I was taught safer and also more efficient in neutral.
Okay.
Were you taught that? I'm pretty sure I taught you that.
Well, if you taught it to me, yeah, but sorry, Raph, that's something I've really liked. You know, they talk about memories, and it's true that there's you actually get rid of ones that you don't, old stuff that you're just not using anymore. That's literally gone. Like that's not even in there anymore. Sorry.
Great, good. Well, as far as I can tell, the genesis of the whole neutral spine thing, because it didn't come from Joseph Pilates, as you know. And
no, because so double click on that. He seemed to more often than not cue a flat back. Well,
I have here in front of me Pilates Return to Life Through Contrology, originally published in 1945. I think I've got about the 2000 edition. Mm-hmm. I'm here on page 17. This is the copy with the white cover with the photo of Joseph on the cover. Page 17, it says, quote, "Therefore, in the reclining exercises, be sure wherever indicated to keep your back full length, always pressed firmly against the mat or floor." End quote.
Hello, posterior pelvic tilt, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And if I've also got the Kindle version of Return to Life, and if you do a search in Kindle for the word neutral, not in there. Joseph doesn't use the term ever.
Well, he also believed that everyone should have a perfectly straight spine and that any natural curves in the spine were a defect.
Yeah, correct.
So if we're saying, and this is where it often bugs me, I must admit, Raph, when it's the argument used is, but it's Pilates. It's not Pilates if I'm not cueing neutral or finding neutral. Well, I mean, that's just totally inaccurate, because if you're going to use that as your argument, then you need to be quoting from Joe Pilates.
Here's the thing that I've noticed. So I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and you and I, Chloe, we're kind of roughly sort of the same age. I mean, you're probably a fair bit younger than me, actually, to be honest. But
44 this year. I'm not that far off you.
Well,
we're both Gen
compared
Xers.
to my daughter Bintu, where you and I are about the same age.
Yeah.
More older than 20.
We're both old to her, no doubt.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And, so probably like me, probably for you, I'm imagining that when you were a kid growing up in Australia, Halloween was not really a tradition. For us it wasn't anyway.
Yeah, I had some fun. I had some fun with it as a teenager because we were kind of into like wearing black and lots of black eyeliner and going to graveyards. So we did a couple of trick or treats. We were really more after the tricking, but it wasn't a big deal in Australia. Not like it is in the States.
Yeah, it's a massive big deal in the States, and so it's very normal in North America, as I see on social media a lot recently, for people to go to great lengths to dress up. People of all ages to dress up.
I wanted to really build here in Australia. I think it's great.
Well, it is building here in Australia, isn't it? Like it's a lot more common, and all of my daughter's friends, are really into it. They made a big day. They went out for weeks beforehand, planning their outfits, going to the op shops and buying old thing and makeup. Ordered makeup off the internet to get their spooky zombie faces on, and all of the rest of it. And so, but here's the thing, when I was a kid, that was not a thing. That was just not part of my universe. It's like I was aware that Halloween existed, right?
Yeah.
But it was just like one of those weird things that the Americans did,
Yeah. You would have seen it on movies and stuff.
Yeah.
But,
Scooby-Doo, stuff like that,
Raph and I are old enough that there wasn't internet, etc. when we were little.
But for my daughter, who was born in 2006, ever since she's been old enough to have memories, Halloween's been a thing, right? So in her mind, Halloween is this eternal tradition that has been going forever, right? Since the
gotcha.
dawn of the universe, right? Before the Big Bang, there was Halloween, It's a tradition, and so when my daughter says to me like, "Oh, what are you doing for Halloween?" I'm like, "Nothing. I don't give a shit about Halloween." She's like, "What the? How could you say such sacrilege? Like, it's inconceivable that someone could."
You didn't get dressed up and go trick-or-treating, Raph? I am
Deny the
disappointed.
tradition of Halloween, but everybody does Halloween. And it's like, no, everybody who's 14 does Halloween if you're in Australia.
This year I actually painted my face as a cat and I gave out treats to some of the cutest had little Batman come and little like witches and it was great.
Yeah, so Halloween's becoming a thing in Australia, right?
Yeah.
But 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it really wasn't a thing.
No, I totally agree.
But if you're 14 years old, you don't know, 20 years ago it's not a thing, right? For her, it's always been a thing. And I think that's the same for us in Pilates, right? 60, 80 years ago when Joseph Pilates was teaching, neutral spine wasn't a thing. He never mentions it. It's not part of his lexicon. It's not part of his repertoire of words. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even part of Romana's lexicon of words until the 1990s, the late 1990s, early 2000s, when, Romana, the second generation, the people taught by Romana were, coming into their own and sort of stepping to the forefront of the industry. I'm thinking about, Moira Stott and et al., those other sort of contemporaries. And, they were influenced, all the, quote, contemporary Pilates, people, they were influenced a lot by physiotherapy and, biomechanics and exercise science. And physiotherapy, if in 1998, was kind of into neutral, And so that kind of got baked into Pilates around about the late 90s.
Got baked in the squat.
Yeah. And so if you're a kid in Pilates years, right, whatever your chronological age, but if you're a kid in Pilates years and you were educated in, say, 2010 or 2015 or 2005 or whatever, it's like, well, you would have got neutral spine. And when I learned neutral spine from Stop Pilates, and I actually went to Toronto and learned it from Moira, I was presented with this book that says, hey, neutral spine. And I was like, oh, this is the tablet of the 10 Commandments. This is manna from heaven. This is God's word, because Moira gave it to me,
Yeah.
And so there was no question in my mind of like, oh, is this true, or where did she hear it from, or anything. It was just like, oh, this is how the universe works. But as I've got a bit more curious and started to investigate and read Joseph's book from cover to cover multiple times and looked at old clips of him teaching and read John Steele's book and everyone do a push-up. And
Cage Lion, how can you just say, oh, John Steele's book, whatever that is.
But, I've learned that, before about the year 2000-ish, neutral spine was not a thing in Pilates. It just wasn't a thing. Came from physiotherapy.
Absolutely. And, well, we know that the Stott syllabus was written in conjunction, my understanding, it was written in conjunction with a physio. And then we also, have other like Polestar, etc., but Brent, physio and so on. So there was this definite influence of physio in the 90s, early 2000s, which was highly steeped in neutral. And here we can reference it. We've talked about this study many, many times, the famous McGill pig spine experiment with the pigs. And I don't want to go down do we go down that route again? But
the seminal study on, I
think we have to. We can't talk about neutral spine and not talk about the pig spine experiment. We have to.
I think that's a really important point for, to understand, just in perspective of the history of Pilates. Neutral is pretty recent, right? It got baked in at about the year 2000. Considering Pilates has been around since the 1930s, right? That's pretty recent. And Joseph was 40 years dead, right?
1920s, actually. I'm presenting the Pilates history lecture this weekend, Raph.
Awesome. So,
a long time, right?
Joseph was like 35 or 40 years, in his grave, the first time neutral spine was mentioned in conjunction with Pilates. So it's just like, so I think that's very interesting. And the final part is like, well, where did physiotherapy get it from? And, is that still important? And, so I think we come back to that seminal study by Callahan and McGill 2001, which they basically got pig spines, which are anatomically pretty similar to human spines, and they stuck them in a jig, a pair of vertebrae. They used C3, C4, so neck vertebrae, pig neck vertebrae, which are anatomically similar to human lumbar vertebrae. And they compressed them and then bent them back and forth 86,400 times, so one time per second for 24 hours.
Was it literally that many times?
It was literally 86,400 times in 24 hours, yes, once per second for 24 hours. Wow. So they got three, they actually, I can't remember if it was three or two. I think they got two, because there's another one which is Guyas et al. They repeated the same experiment in 2015, which I think they did three groups. So in the Callahan and McGill study, they had two groups. One group, maybe they had four groups. Anyway, no, they had four groups. They had a high load group and a low load group. So they had spines that were compressed a lot and spines that were not compressed a lot. And then they had spines that bent, full range, and spines that didn't bend full range. And what they found was the ones that were compressed a lot, whether they bent or whether they didn't bend, they all got injured. And the ones that weren't compressed a lot, whether they bent or didn't bend, none of them were injured. So what that study showed was that the amount of compression that is applied to the spine is the biggest risk factor for injury, not how much the spine bends.
Right.
So I think that, where people got confused with that study, and I'll link to it in the show notes so you can read it yourself if you want, but is that, like I said, only the spines in the high load group were injured. So regardless of whether they bent or didn't bend, the high load ones were all injured, the low load ones weren't injured. But the high load ones, the ones that bent, were injured in a different place from the ones that didn't bend.
Yeah.
Right? And so the ones that didn't bend, they were just kind of basically straight. They were, one vertebrae kind of stacked on top of the other, and they were, just compressed, like in a sandwich, these two vertebrae sort of squished into each other. Well, the ones, they were injured by the end plate, so basically the base of the vertebra basically cracking, right? The end plate fractured, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, we think about it, if the vertebrae kind of just stacked flat on top of each other and you squash them,
Makes sense.
That's a bit that cracks, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the ones that were bending back and forwards, it was the discs and also the bones at the back, like the pars interarticularis, the sort of back part of the vertebra, that was injured because that's the bit as it bends backwards and forwards, those are the bits that were stressed the most, right? So the number of injuries was the same between the bending and the non-bending. It's just where the injury was that was different. And so the problem that came from that is the soundbite was flexion caused disc injuries, right?
Gotcha.
But what they missed out was a neutral caused end plate fractures.
Yeah, I was going to say like fractures of your vertebrae.
Right. So we just chopped off that other half of the soundbite.
Because that wouldn't suck,
Right. So ultimately, and that experiment's been repeated by, I think it was Guyas et al., and they found the same thing. And they had 6 groups. Yeah.
Yeah, and Raph, with that as well was the concept too that with that experiment, all the ligaments, the connective tissue, which is like all the great stuff that surrounds our spine, was stripped away. So all that was really there were the discs and the vertebrae.
They described it as the osteoligamentous spine, which they weren't precise about which ligaments they kept and which ones they didn't. So I'm assuming they had the anterior longitudinal ligament, the posterior longitudinal ligament. I'm not sure if they had the nuchal ligament or the interspinous ligament or the supraspinous ligament, or it's not clear to me which if any they had.
Yeah. They didn't have the lumbar dorsal fascia and all of these things that we know actually take so much load when we are actually flexing our spines. So it's not a complete picture, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Right.
It's not true. We don't walk around like with all this other stuff stripped off us as we're doing things, right?
No, and it's like, well, if you said to me, hey, Raph, I'm going to go to the gym and do 86,400 deadlifts in one set, Do you think that's
reckon
a good
that's a good
plan?
idea? It's a good program?
No, I don't think it is a good plan. You know,
You might pull up a bit sore after that, Cloe.
Yeah.
Might be a little more than DOMs with that one.
Yeah, but maybe take those 86,400 deadlifts and do like 3 sets of 10 with a 3-minute rest in between, and do that twice a week for the next 27 years, right? And that'll be 86,400, and you'll get a lot stronger over that period.
Yeah.
You know, so it wasn't really a study that we can extrapolate to real life.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. So from there came this obsession that actually loading in neutral is safer. And that could be in air quotes, couldn't it? The safer part could be in air quotes.
Yeah. It should be in air quotes, because subsequently this is now, that was in 2001, Callahan and McGill, the pig spine experiment.
2001. So that was 20 years ago.
20 years ago this year.
Yeah, right.
And so there's been a truckload of additional research since then, and we've got really quite a lot of research now. I would say, in my view, it's getting to the point where I would call it overwhelming. Is it getting to the point where it starts to say, you know, when you finally, there's enough? It's kind of like with all the acupuncture studies, and it says, really, no further study is going to find anything different. You know, when they finally get to that? When we've got 200 studies and they all found no difference, you know, like how many more studies do you need to do?
You can stop wasting your research funds on this and concentrate on something else, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is it getting there?
Yeah. I think we're not quite there yet. But what we do have is a number of lines of research. So we've got biomechanical researchers. We've got biomechanical research showing that the forces on the spine are the same whether you bend your back or don't bend your back when you lift. Mm-hmm. We've got studies showing that actually elite lifters, you know, like power lifters, flex their back when they're lifting maximally. And we've also got biomechanical studies showing that actually when people lift maximally, like lift the heaviest load they can lift, lifting with a flexed spine is actually is associated with greater strength and better movement efficiency, so less energy to move the same amount of weight. We've also got studies showing that lifting with a bent back so like we look at people in the workplace and we go and observe them, see who lifts with a straight back, who lifts with a bent back, right? And then we come back a year later and say, okay, who's got back pain? And what we find is how people lift doesn't predict whether they're going to have pain a year later, right? And then we have other studies that look at people who do have back pain and people who don't have back pain right now, and then we go and ask them to go and lift up some stuff. Like there's this one study where they got them to go and, you know, they had a group of people with back pain, group of people with no back pain, and they got them to go and lift up something relatively light off the floor about 100 times each, right? And they just watched how they lifted and measured how they lifted it. What they found was people with back pain lift with a more straight spine than people without back pain. I mean, if you think about it, right? If you don't have back pain, right?
It's a no-brainer.
Yeah. I mean, when you walk into the lounge room and there's, you know, something got to pick up off the floor, like some kids left some toys on the floor or whatever. It's like you just bend over and you bend your back and keep your legs straight and pick it up off the floor, right? That's just a normal movement. And the reason we do that is because that's the most efficient way to get your hand to the floor. Like, I mean, just try it now. Like if you listen to this, as long as you're not driving a car, you know, like just be really relaxed, okay, and just bend over and pick something, you know, like put your hand on the floor, right? Bend your knees if you have to, but like basically keep your legs straight-ish and just bend your spine and reach your hand to the floor. Now, come up to straight, okay? Brace yourself in neutral, keep your spine neutral the whole way, and now reach your hand to the floor. How much more energy is it to squat down with your torso braced in neutral to pick up a coffee cup or something?
It's the classic.
It's ridiculous.
It's the classic workplace health and safety lifting manual, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where it's all of that. I can picture the pictures now, you know, with everyone trying to hold this straight back as they're lifting the box, etc. But aren't there studies on that as well, though? That
when we go into workplaces and teach people how to lift with a straight back and lift with the legs, not the back and all that, it makes no difference to how much back pain those people have, you know, over time. It's like it doesn't make a difference. So I mean, there's an interesting study which looked at disc herniations. So, you know, lumbar disc herniations, and they try to track back and figure out what was the inciting event, or like what was the cause? How did they get the herniation? How did it herniate? And basically what they found was in the vast majority of cases, there was no identifiable inciting event, right? So there wasn't like, I was lifting a car off a dying child, or, I was squatting at the gym, and it's like there was nothing like that. It was just like I bent over to pick my keys up off the nightstand and my back went, or I just woke up and my back was really sore. Or
I had a sore back when I woke up this morning. I was like, oh, damn it. It's the old gets you in your sleep.
Right. But these weren't just people with pain. These were people with like MRI showing, herniated disc, right?
Gotcha.
And they're trying to figure out like when did it herniate. And basically the thing was they couldn't figure it out because there was no, quote, inciting event. People just had no recollection of like, I was squatting at the gym and my back went tweak. Right.
And then, though, are we saying what came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, could they have had that? We
could have had it,
with
right.
Scans, could have been there for a long time. So yeah.
Right, but this study found literally no statistical association between like a lifting event and a disc herniation. So the vast majority of disc herniations, it seems, are not caused by or related to lifting. They just happen by mysterious and probably natural processes.
Right. Okay. So looping back to footwork, Raphael, what's our chance of herniating a disc with all springs on, laying on our back, not in neutral?
Well, I'm not going to go biomechanical on this one. I'm just going to give you two metaphors.
Okay.
Right. So Joseph Pilates died at the age of, what was he, like 83 or something like that, 84?
Wasn't he 86?
80, yes, anyway, he was in his 80s.
Anyway, I should know that again. I'm delivering history lesson on the weekend. I need to. He was in his 80s.
As I understand it, his footwork was done generally on 3 full springs. That's the law I got down from Moira. I'm not sure where she got that from, but do you know what springs Joseph used for footwork?
I was of the impression they were all the springs that were on the Universal Reformer.
Okay. All right, so as heavy as possible.
Heavy.
Yeah. All right,
yeah.
And so he had, himself doing, footwork. Presumably he did footwork from time to time. I imagine he did it quite regularly, on full springs. And remember from page 17 of Return to Life, with the spine pressed full length firmly to the mat or floor, right, or the reformer carriage. So he's doing footwork on all the springs in full lumbar flexion for many decades, right? Happy as Larry. Okay. And so that's one thing. And, what about all of the
cigars that were the thing that took him down in the end. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And, what about all of the people in classical Pilates who still follow that, press the spine to the like, they're not exploding when they do their footwork. They seem to be fine. And then I'm just going to direct you to something which I just love and I can't resist linking to in the show notes, which is the World Deadlift Championships 2016, which was just about the greatest deadlift championships ever because multiple records were broken in the course of like 10 minutes. Like the record was broken and rebroken and rebroken and rebroken. And it's just these humans just lifting weights beyond what's conceivable. Like they eventually broke the record stood at 500 kilos, which is over 1,000 pounds. Like it is just it's a imperial ton. It's fucking inconceivable. And when you look at, I love this particular video because it's filmed from the side, and so you can see their spinal position very clearly as they're lifting, and this is way more than 34 degrees. They're flexed, like fully flexed, and that totally makes sense when you read the research and understand that actually the spine is more efficient and stronger in a fully flexed position because, I'm sorry, I can't resist a tiny bit of anatomy and biomechanics. When you lift something like in a deadlift, you lift anything off the ground, okay? You're using your muscles to produce force, okay? And you can, if you're lifting off the ground, you can use your leg muscles, you can use your hip muscles, like you use your quads and your hamstrings, you can use your glutes and your adductors, you can use a whole bunch of muscles, and you can also use your back muscles, right? And you can use some combination. So if you use more back, you can use less legs and vice versa, right? And so it turns out that the back muscles produce the most force when the back is kind of neutral or slightly extended, right? So if you contract your spinal extensors, they contract most forcefully when you're in a slight extension, okay? And then as you bend forward, the spinal muscles, the extensor muscles, they relax and they produce less and less force until when you fully flex, the spinal extensors, basically they go silent. It's called the flexion relaxation reflex. And basically your muscles relax. You know, when you're standing and you do a forward bend, your back muscles relax. But as we talked about right at the start, as you bend forward, the ligaments at the back of your spine go tight, right? And it just so happens that the ligaments at the back of your spine are strong as fuck. They're really fucking strong, right? And so they're way stronger than your back muscles. Doesn't matter how many back exercises you've done, that's right. A Mack truck is going to be stronger than a Mini. You know, it doesn't matter what engine you put in the Mini, right? The Mack truck is still stronger. And that is your spinal ligaments. They are going to be stronger than your spinal muscles, right? So when you're in neutral, right, remembering that we said right at the start, the definition of neutral is where the ligaments are lax, right? So if you pick something up off the ground, right, and your spine is in neutral, your ligaments are lax, they're contributing nothing to the force production, right? And your muscles are doing it, right? Which is all good and all great. And if you want to build your back muscles, that's a great way to do it, okay? But if you want to pick up the heaviest thing possible, okay, you've got to produce the most force possible, right? And your ligaments, if you bend forwards, okay, until they go tight, they produce way more force than your muscles can. So that is why you see elite powerlifters, when they deadlift, okay, they like 95% of them flex like to their full extent of their spinal flexion, like they flex fully as they deadlift. And I'm talking about as they deadlift 4 to 5 times body weight. Like this is not like, you know, in the pump class at the local gym, okay? So if you want,
Footwork, Raph.
Or in Footwork. So I'm going to stick that in the show notes. Go watch Eddie Hall, Thor Bjornsson, et al., you know, Benny Magnuson lifting just superhuman weights with fully flexed spines. It's a beautiful view from the side. And just thinking about the fact that what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the natural strength of their spinal ligaments, okay, the posterior longitudinal ligament, the nuchal ligament, the supraspinous ligament, the lumbodorsal fascia, all of these ligaments, which are incredibly robust, strong structures. They're producing force in their legs, and they're using those spinal ligaments to transfer the force up their torso to their arms. You know, no one tells you to contract your arm muscles when you do a deadlift and, you know, do a bicep curl while you're doing it, okay? Because if you just hang your arms, you can pick up a lot more than if you lift with your arms at the same time, because your arm muscles are nowhere near as strong as your shoulder ligaments, right? It's pretty obvious, right? Same in your back.
Great. Well, I think we've ticked, you know, we've explored, well, what is neutral? We've explored, can it be palpated or visually determined? And that's a hard no. And we've explored, well, do we need to care about it? And that is also a hard no.
Yeah.
So I think that I would really love this myth to just be gone now. What do you think, Raph?
Well, I don't know. I'm not holding my breath, but I think I would just like to, you know, just before we finish, I would just like to say, because sometimes, you know, when we have conversations like this, sometimes people can feel like a little bit nihilistic, and it's like, oh, well, if we don't care about neutral, it's like, what about in a plank? Can I just do any position now? Does it matter?
Well, you can. You can do any position, like if you're saying to me, can you do any position in the plank? Well, you actually can.
You actually can, yeah. But I guess the position.
But are there positions where you might be getting potentially stronger for what are you then going to be doing with that? So is that what you're thinking?
Well, I'm more thinking like as an instructor, right? If I'm no longer kind of cueing my clients to be safe, right? Well, what should I cue, right? Does it not matter what position anyone's in anymore? Is it just a free-for-all? Can anyone it's just like, hey, guys, there's the reformers over there. Go do whatever you want. I'll be back in an hour, you know? Like, is that where we're at now?
I'll just sit in the corner, drink my coffee and play on Instagram. Come on, we know this. We've spoken about this before. Like there's certain shapes, you know, if we're talking about, you know, if we're referencing, for instance, the contrology exercises, if I'm thinking about something like a long stretch, which, you know, I often refer to get people into it, it's kind of like a fancy name for a plank. But then what we look at, if I'm wanting to then finesse the shape of the long stretch and I'm wanting to get it more towards, well, what was the contrology long stretch? Well, we're seeing a little bit more of like, it's basically the full interpretation of your hundreds flipped upside down. So we're seeing that hollow body shape. So the long stretch, if I'm trying to coach my clients into a contrology long stretch from a shape perspective, that's going to look like a bit of a flexed sort of plank, you know, it's a bit of a tucked butt, the legs are together, you know, there is a shape to the exercise that we're getting towards. Would you agree with that? You know, if it's a down stretch, well, the down stretch is ultimately it's a back bend and you're rocking that back bend forward and back whilst maintaining that shape. So do we have a role in coaching shapes in Pilates exercises? 100%. Am I coaching those shapes because I inherently think one is safer than the other? Absolutely freaking no.
And if I've learned to do long stretch in a neutral spine, which a lot of people have, is that wrong? Am I a bad person? Can I still teach that?
You're a horrible person, Raph. No, you do you, boo. That's what Laura would say. You do you. No, so, if you like teaching it in the, you know, I've got to stop doing these air quotes. If you like teaching it in a neutral-ish, visually, you know, plankish thing, go for it. I personally really enjoy the more gymnastic element of the contrology exercises. So I do coach my clients into that more flex position.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think like, well, if you like teaching in neutral, great, fine. You know, if you like the aesthetics of it, or you know, for whatever reason, like, great. But I would say, stop telling people it's safer.
Correct. Be really mindful of the narrative, and that, to me, that's really important. Yeah.
So teach whatever darn position you want, really. If you want to teach neutral, great. If you want to teach flexion, great. Extension, rotation, whatever. Teach it all. But stop telling people that one position's better than the other position.
We need to come from a place of fearless movement and anti-fragility, and Great. Love that, Raph.
Good talk, Chloe.